Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. I'm Gene Paranak. Today is episode number 80, Friday, October 22nd. We're glad you're with us today. As always, we'll go through the local COVID news as well as some national news. After that, the co-founder of Near the Box, Adi Gandra, will be with us to talk about HIPAA software development. This is actually quite a hot topic and something that you need to understand. A lot of parallels to how things work with the FDA, but obviously a very different thing having to do with patient protection, patient privacy. So we'll get all into that. After that, time for Q&A if there's questions. First though, I want to do a quick screen share here to show you that agenda. There it is. And right into the COVID news. Today, COVID metrics and vaccine distribution. Our data, as always, from covid.cdc.gov. The community transmission across the U.S. Starting to show pockets of relief. Mostly a sea of red, but starting to show pockets of relief. We're going to talk at the end of this COVID presentation some of the latest news out of Nature as to why that transmission is so high. We're starting to learn a few things nationally. Good news, inpatient beds. This was more of a sea of red before. Two states down in the bright reds, but generally things are looking better and better, as you might hear on the national news. That doesn't mean that there aren't counties that see 20 plus beds out of 100 with COVID patients, and that 20, as we always mention, is an important number because most hospitals have to run 80% full to stay profitable. So if you throw an extra 20 COVID patients in, you're putting them in the hallways after that. In terms of vaccinations, the down from the peak, just this wavering line hovering somewhere below 1 million per day. That's where we continue to be over the last handful of months. In the state of Michigan, currently a sea of red as it has been for the last 2 months or so. Transmission in every county high, and definitely descended into this trough on the right side. When we will come out, anybody's guess. And we see all these little inflections and we say, well, maybe it's happening, maybe we're coming out of this, but the case count continues to climb in Michigan. We're now at case counts that begin to look similar to the last two waves in the state of Michigan. A little bit of good news here. We've added a line, a horizontal line, to show the positivity rate of the current wave. And that positivity rate is quite a bit lower than the positivity rate of the last two waves. So that could be seen as a bit of good news. Certainly when we look at deaths, good news. But it continues to creep up. It's a very slow creep compared to the last two waves that shot up, but it's not negligible. It's there, and certainly our thoughts go out to those who are suffering, especially losing loved ones to COVID-19. In terms of hospital admissions, the trend nowhere near as steep as it has been under the last two waves. That's good, although I got to say this last week now it sort of shows an uptick, so we don't know what will happen there. Everyone's asking what's going to happen this fall. We should say on a national level, pretty prominent folks are starting to say, oh, COVID's not going to be a big worry this next year. I think we've heard enough things in all different directions that wait and see is probably the better approach. This graphic that CDC puts for every state, really fascinating. Now showing more and more dark purple, showing high transmission even with 50+% vaccination rates in the dark purple counties, dark red also prominent. Just not a lot where we'd like to see it in the turquoise regions. And as we start to ask that question of why aren't the vaccines preventing transmission, why have we been stuck in high transmission for the last 2 months? Also, really quickly, the Delta variant is now 1% up in the state of Michigan. It's 98.7%, up from about 97.3% last week. So the dominant strain. But what about vaccination and transmission? Why isn't vaccination doing what we might have hoped for with transmission? Obviously, a part of that answer, the Delta variant, but why? Why is that making a difference? The journal Nature starting to publish a lot on this question. 2 articles here for your consideration. COVID vaccines cut the risk of transmitting Delta, but not for long. That's their conclusion. They say, unfortunately, the vaccine's beneficial effect on Delta transmission waned to almost negligible levels over time. Prominent with the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not heavily in the US, but going with that vaccine, 3 months took it from 57% that you would infect somebody close to you. So if you get the vaccine, you've got a 57% chance of infecting someone close to you, right back up to 67%, which is pretty much what you expect for an unvaccinated person. A little bit better out of Pfizer. Pfizer took it all the way down to 42% chance of infecting someone close to you if you had the vaccine, but that back up to 58% within striking distance of that 67%. So that is probably partly why we're seeing the spread that we're seeing. This also from the journal Nature. Delta's rise is fueled by rampant spread from people who feel fine. They said that 74% of infections that they found with Delta took place during the pre-symptomatic phase. That's not good news. It's a higher proportion than for previous variants. So this makes sense if the vaccine's effectiveness against transmission, again, not against hospitalization and death or severe hospitalization and death, exposure to the virus through the vaccine to the spike protein does continue to show real protection against hospitalization and death. But this explains a little bit why the transmission continues unabated. These 2 articles from the journal Nature. So, not the greatest news in the world, but it also helps to understand why the CDC has recommended and continues to recommend indoor masking for everybody, because we're in that transmission phase. They say when the transmission is at substantial or high levels, which of course most of the US, that is a true statement right now. That's the latest on COVID. We will pause briefly here for any questions or comments related to that segment of the show. See if we have any hands raised. Always like to pause there because up next, something that really touches our community of MedTech development. You hear us talking a lot about the FDA and how to comply with the FDA's expectations. But there's a big thing that happens in the world of MedTech, and that is patient privacy. And we don't talk a lot about that, but today I have Adi Gandra with me from Near the Box.
Hey, Gene.
And there's Adi. Welcome to the show. We're glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to be on. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because we all sort of have this basic idea of HIPAA. Oh, it's there to protect me. I know, I see all these forms flying by when we go to doctors and things like that. But you guys are engaged in the world of software development, and a part of that being working with software for HIPAA. Before we get into HIPAA, though, we'd love to know about Adi. Tell us more. You co-founded this company. You've had industry experience. How did you get to be doing what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit about me. I have been programming most of my life. I've been coding since childhood, and just something that's always interested me was creating software and creating web apps and just creating great experiences for people to utilize technology. And did a computer science undergrad degree at Indiana University, came out, and I worked at a Groupon subsidiary company called Poggled, based in Chicago for about a year. And after that, I kind of broke out on my own and realized that I could take my engineering experience, and since I've been doing it my entire life, and over the last 8 years, I've been contracting to then founded my own company, Near the Box, where we kind of act as a technical and innovation partner. We want to be that like engineering perspective on companies to build great products.
Yeah, that's really cool. And of course, Near the Box, not just you, met through John Laughlin, who introduced us, and you guys have a team there, which is really cool. We're going to talk more about Near the Box towards the end of our time, but tell us just a tiny bit about the company and what kinds of things you guys work on, and what sorts of things you're interested in.
Yeah, so obviously we do a good amount in health tech, but we work across different verticals as well. I like to describe us, like I said, as a technical and innovation partner with engineering focus. So while there might be a lot of developers out there, dev shops, or just people even needing that service, we like to come in more as a partner. So we'll either work with startups to kind of come in at the ground level and spin up a product and make something that's scalable, or we'll work with even sometimes larger corporations and create innovation products for them. So the questions they might ask us is, how do we build something that's going to scale to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of users without having to run into significant roadblocks? And that's something we've proven we can do, and we've done repeatedly. And I think our engineering mindset really helps with that, because it's not just building a product and being done with it. We like to think about scale and just like long-term value. So
Yeah,
it's a little bit about how we differentiate.
that's really cool. It's a very important thing, and a lot of echoes there, I know, for how our business works in terms of med device development. We live in sort of these parallel worlds. And one of the challenges I know we often encounter is people come to us and they'll say, give me the checklist. I'd like the checklist for FDA. Just hand it to me. I'll do the work myself because, just give me the checklist and I'll fill in all the boxes. And you just kind of shake your head slowly and go, wait, but FDA doesn't work on a checklist. They don't work on a do all these things exactly this way that they've always been done before, and then everything will be fine. They work in the world of processes. And as you and I were talking, it sounds like that's how HIPAA is too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would have loved there to be a checklist 5 years ago when I was starting my first health tech project, and I did a lot of Googling, a lot of research for that checklist, and it's not out there. But it is kind of how HIPAA works too. There's definitely strict rules in HIPAA, but a lot of it is guidelines.
Mm,
There's not anyone that's going to come and say you're HIPAA certified. I mean, yes, you can get audited by a law firm or third party, but there's no government agency that's going to say, hey, you're officially HIPAA compliant, you've done X, Y, and Z. More so, there's a bunch of rules, a bunch of guidelines that you need to implement, and you need to always be diligent with, because HIPAA is not a one-time thing. It's a lot of it actually is, are you always HIPAA compliant? Do you always have safeguards in place to protect that information? So it is definitely not a checklist, and does sound kind of similar to the FDA regulations as well.
Now, I know you guys don't provide like legal uh, advice for HIPAA or things like that. And so this question may be outside of your realm, but I know like in the world of FDA, it's also the same thing. You can't get FDA certified,
Yeah.
but there may come a point where the government through FDA audits you, and if you pass that, it feels pretty good. You can't call it anything,
Yeah.
but you can feel pretty good about it. Is there an equivalent in the world of HIPAA software where you feel like now we've made it, or now we've been examined in some way or audited by the government?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we've usually engage different health tech specialized law firms, and they will come in and look at our processes and make sure that we're kind of up to par. Um, and for the most part, if you're getting audited for HIPAA purposes, you probably have had a breach, and that's not a thing you want. So, um, there's not really, I'm not sure about the FDA, but in HIPAA, for the most part, there's no government agency that's going to come in and audit you unless things are kind of going poorly, or there's been a tip for them, or there's been a breach or something like that. So the one thing I will say is, when you will be audited, and this might be useful for the startups, is acquisitions, fundraising rounds, um, investors, companies that might buy you are going to do a lot of diligence into your setup, and if you're HIPAA compliant, and if you have been HIPAA compliant for the entire life cycle of your company. So that's something where that might come into account, and those investors might do the diligence to audit you, or get a law firm to audit you and make sure you're compliant.
That's the kind of thing that strikes me leaves a lot of room to go a long ways and then discover that you hadn't done the right thing, and backtracking becomes very hard.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a concern. I think a big thing in HIPAA is just about staying diligent. Are you, one of the HIPAA guidelines is, are you doing a security risk analysis every year? So, while there are specific rules, but like I said, a lot of it are guidelines. So if you're kind of following the theme of the guidelines, you hopefully should be okay. And there are specific rules which are more clear cut laid out that you'll need to follow. But in terms of that, it's a lot of staying diligent, doing the risk assessment, having a privacy officer that is going to examine how your data is being used, doing kind of security analysis, doing maybe code review and stuff like that, a lot of best practices. And I think a big part of HIPAA also is from the start is, even if you might slip up, maybe not have a breach, but you realize something's not being done the right way, from the start, there's a lot of legal requirements, like a lot of policies and procedures that need to be put in place. So what people might not realize is that, like you said, it's not a checklist, but there are a lot of guidelines. And part of that guidelines is you need to have legal requirements in place for a variety of things. You need to have legal documents for instance, what happens if there's a disaster and a fire burns down one of your data warehouses? What if you need to have policies for access rights, audit controls, authentication controls, training policies? Everyone needs to be HIPAA trained once a year. So there's a lot of legal guidelines that you need to make sure you have thought about before you kind of start your project. And it is difficult to go back and backtrack, but hopefully by having these policies in place, you kind of laid the groundwork to come in and fix any problems you might have.
That's great. We actually have one question already. I'm going to let Steve here ask his question real quick. Steve, you're live.
All right, thank you. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about PHI, PII, and anonymizing data for security.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, if you're dealing with any sort of PHI, you are going to be regulated by HIPAA in the US. So even if you're not a practice, a healthcare practice provider, plan, or clearinghouse, you're going to be a business associate if you're dealing with this data. So if you're storing that data, if you're creating it, you're transferring it, you're using it in any way, you're going to fall under HIPAA. So if you're dealing with PHI, you need to kind of know about or be aware of HIPAA guidelines and try to practice them. In terms of anonymizing the data, like you can anonymize, I think there's under the safe harbor law, which is under the privacy rule of HIPAA, there's a couple of things you can anonymize to share that data in a more public setting. So anything obviously that might make the patient identifiable, address, name, number, email. There's a huge list of stuff that you would have to anonymize if you want to kind of store the data, possibly outside of HIPAA. And I say possibly, this is kind of more the legal aspect of stuff, when I kind of have more of the developer mindset on how to implement this stuff.
That's a great question, Steve. I guess, Adi, if you would take us back, because some of the terms that are used there might not be familiar to some of our listeners. Take us back to sort of the overarching rules or expectations of HIPAA, where things like this idea of PHI and other stuff emerge. So just so our audience has a sort of an overview of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Steve, I hope that was helpful. The three kind of overarching rules of HIPAA, there's the privacy rule, the security rule, and the breach notification rule. So the privacy rule kind of outlines what I talked about in the last section, which is what defines PHI, how organizations can share it, the restriction of usage of the information, kind of everything in regards to information. That's the privacy rule. The security rule kind of sets the standard for protection of PHI. What safeguards are there to create, receive, and store PHI? What are your policies and procedures? Security rule is primarily where I live. In terms of creating applications, you want to make sure you're following the security rule. Granted that you already know you're applicable through the privacy rule. So security rules where most of my domain knowledge is. And then there's a breach notification rule, which hopefully no one has to ever experience, but it requires entities to like send alerts if you discover a breach and kind of have to send those alerts within 60 days. So kind of very high level.
So we're at this high level, we're kind of saying, if I understand correctly, hey, people have private information and it matters that it stays private. You got to do something to protect it. And if somehow it gets out, we got to know about it. Is that a fair overarching assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. That is, you know, kind of the purpose of HIPAA is what is the information that's protected? You know, what's the identifiable information for patients? Like, how can you identify them? And obviously address, name, email, there's a phone number, there's a big list. And then what are the guidelines for protecting that information as a security role? And just like you said, identifying them as notifying of any breaches is the last role, the breach notification role.
That's great. It's a good overview. And then you mentioned the policies and controls and things like that. Boy, so many similarities to how things work with the FDA. We got these principles that we're trying to satisfy, but then we got to have policies and procedures. Is this true for all of the rules? So like you've got to have policies in place that address each part of it?
Yeah, I think so. There's general policies that you need to have in place, and then there's like specific security policies that you need to have in place. And it's a giant, I'm not going to say checklist, but there's a giant list of, you know, circumstances you need to have plans in place. And I think I mentioned briefly before, like a specific guideline in HIPAA is data backups and archiving. You need to have data across multiple regions in case anything happens to one. So you need to have a policy in place for disaster. Okay, what happens if my data is compromised in one location? There's a fire or some, you know, natural disaster event. How can I access my data? Because not only do you need to store the data securely, you need to make sure it's accessible for patients down the line, and that you're not going to just lose their information and how you're storing it. So, and there's a wide variety of these policies that kind of are legal documents that you need to put together for kind of how everything is going to work and kind of cover yourself at the start of projects.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, so what does this look like? We set out here to develop something. It's what you guys do, and folks can partner with you to do this. What are some of the things that you're going to be thinking about when you're developing an app?
Yeah, so I think one helpful thing, just to even jump back to the legal policies and procedures, is there are tools out there that can help with a lot of this. So one thing I've used on a lot of projects, I know a lot of health tech startups use, is this SaaS called Accountable HQ. And they will kind of outline a ton of these policies and procedures, let you choose which ones to implement, let you write your own. They'll give you a security risk assessment for you to do yearly. They'll provide HIPAA training for your employees. So I think one helpful thing is, like, when you're starting these projects, look for what's already out there. You don't want to, especially from a startup perspective, you don't want to go there and reinvent the wheel, get a law firm to come through and do a very expensive diligence process when there might be a tool out there that, you know, is applicable for a lot of the stuff you're using. Obviously, you should get legal advice and contact a lawyer and make sure you're covered, but there are a lot of this that you can get value from that already exists out there. So I think that's a high level thing that everyone should think about. And then also in building an application, a lot of it has to do with the setup. Obviously, HIPAA is always an ongoing thing, but a lot of the work comes from just making sure you're set up properly in the first place. So even outside the legal aspect of it, you want to make sure whoever you're using to store your PHI, for instance, your hosting provider or your service used to send mails, or if you send text messages, you need to have BAAs with all of them. So they need to be HIPAA certified themselves.
Gotcha. And you got to have that sort of remind us the definition of BAA.
Yeah, it's a business associate agreement. So, you know, one thing is that, like I said before, is just because you're not a physician's office or provider plan or a health insurance company doesn't mean you need to not follow HIPAA. If you have PHI, you most likely are going to need to follow HIPAA guidelines. And that also goes for companies you use. Like for instance, if you use Amazon AWS to store or to host your site and do a lot of your infrastructure stuff, everything they do needs to be HIPAA compliant, right? To ensure that you're HIPAA compliant. So you need to sign a business associate agreement with them where they say, hey, we're going to be HIPAA compliant. The hardware we're going to use, we have disaster plans in place on our side, and everything you do, they're going to do on their side. So you know they're covered. So you're going to sign a BAA with them and kind of make sure that you're protected from that standpoint as well.
This kind of goes back to we may have security in each of our companies, for example, but the whole idea of a leak, and it can leak at the point of transfer, is, and you're sort of saying, no, you guys are going to pick it up and you're going to take care of it with the same concern that we're taking care of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you sign a business associate agreement, and as a company, you might even have contractors or other companies that you outsource work to, and you're going to want a BAA with them if they're handling any of your PHI. And that's because when you sign a BAA with someone, ideally they also are following HIPAA guidelines and they're HIPAA compliant. So there's that level of safety then where, okay, I've signed a BAA with them. I know they have the plans and policies in place to be HIPAA compliant, which then flows downstream and makes me HIPAA compliant.
We don't spend a lot of time thinking about the details of like a non-disclosure agreement between two companies considering a business relationship, but there does seem to be some similarity. And neither one of us is lawyers. We don't play lawyers on TV. Just got to disclaim that for everybody. But it does seem like there's a similarity there where you're saying, I'm going to give you something. I need you to take care of it with the same concern that I have for it.
Yep, that's absolutely correct. And it's something you always need to stay diligent with, because over the course the lifetime of your company or your product, especially in software, you're always going to be adding new features, integrating with new third parties, whether it's a payment provider, a mailing service, Twilio for text, Amazon for hosting, the list goes on, but you're going to want to make sure that you have BAAs with them. And it even applies to, let's say you have a Slack group for your company and you're discussing patient information. You're going to want to have a BAA plan with Slack, because if you're transmitting patient information, you need to have a BAA with them.
That's great. That's really helpful. We got the questions coming in here. First of all, I want to ask this one from Ken Spencer. How do telemedicine companies deal with these issues?
Yeah, I think telemedicine companies, just like our health tech companies, right? So they're going through, and it is not trivial to kind of start these health tech companies. There's a lot more work required at the start than a normal startup, I would say. So a lot of times, obviously these companies are funded and then they spend the time doing their diligence. I would say getting a legal firm. That's been my experience with the health tech companies we've started, where we know HIPAA from a application building development standpoint, but there's also the legal aspect, and we need to make sure we're covered and we're getting kind of sign off from our legal firm. So I would say that the telemedicine companies are probably using a variety of tools. I know this one telemedicine company is using this accountable tool, actually, which I just mentioned before. And so I know people are using some of these pre-built tools online, but at the same time, they are getting legal sign off for sure.
Gotcha. And Ken, to the point of your question, if there's something more specific about telemedicine companies that was the focus of your question, feel free to either raise your hand, we'll bring you live, or you can ask it again in Q&A. I'd be interested to know if there was another further detail there. While we're waiting to see if Ken has a question there, Steve, back on another question.
Right. So we've talked about data protection, records, protecting records from getting out. Can you speak a little bit about protecting records as well for retention, for legal purposes, and being able to give copies of records to patients that request them, those sorts of things, the timeframes that would be included in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a big thing, and this is once again from a development perspective, is we need to keep logs and backups of every user request to the site, every copy of PHI. We need to have an audit trail, and usually we need to keep that for 3 years, I think. So essentially what we do is we have, for a lot of the projects, we utilize Amazon or Azure, and we have a BA with them, and we store this data there, and we store it across different regions. So it's always available, even if there's a problem at one region, because you need to have your data backed up by multiple regions for the most part to prevent disaster mitigation. So that's kind of one of the ways we approach it. But yeah, so and then along those lines, every kind of BAA you sign with these third-party companies you might integrate with too, probably needs to also be storing data in them. If they're signing the BAA, I'm sure they are. So you might need access to that data as well over the life cycle of your company, or how long HIPAA says, which I think from my what I remember is about 3 years you should keep records for.
Great, thanks for the question. Good answer. Well, it's sort of interesting when you bring up these BAAs to third parties, and you mentioned there are third parties out there doing things. Oh, we do have a question here back from Ken Spencer. Let's allow Ken on to ask his question. Ken, you're live.
Okay, thank you. Well, really interesting stuff. So I'm starting to see from Michigan Medicine some emerging companies that are getting started here in terms of, I hate to call it decision support because that's crossing the red line, but they're looking at things where you can go online and say, here are my symptoms. Should I go see a doctor or not? And so it's very interesting because the questions coming out of these companies are, what kind of FDA regulatory pathway do I have? And they're all HIPAA questions and things. And in particular, currently, there's some things like, do I have the flu, or, am I coming down with COVID-19, kind of stuff, right? So, I mean, are you able to assist these people in looking at those kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely assist in those types of things. Where I would say is, if they're asking the questions along the lines of, do I need to be HIPAA, like, am I covered under HIPAA just because people are entering their symptoms in? That would probably be better suited for a lawyer to say, hey, just because they're entering their questions, you need to be HIPAA compliant, or you don't need to be HIPAA compliant. Because if you don't have to be HIPAA compliant, it's much easier. You have a much easier life than going through everything and being and dealing with this. So I will say though that if you're like collecting even their IP address, that's probably identifiable. And then if they're entering their symptoms and they have an IP address and you're storing that, you might have to be covered under HIPAA. But I would definitely double check with the lawyer. And then in terms of kind of my role and how I can help, it would be more in sorts of HIPAA implementation, especially from an engineering standpoint and product building standpoint.
Okay, well, that's helpful, because that's exactly the kind of questions they're asking. Do I need to be HIPAA compliant? Kind of stuff, right? So we're actually searching for some local attorneys that can provide good advice there. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah,
Great,
absolutely,
thanks,
no problem.
Appreciate that. Well, so we were talking about these BAAs and creating sort of safe portals for the data to go through for security, and there's analogies to the med device world too. Here, oftentimes people will see a software product out there, and the software product will advertise that it's doing this thing for you. And I imagine those are out there for HIPAA as well. We see those in the world of MedTech development, where a company will sort of give you the impression that if you just come to them and use their piece of software, that all of your, for example, quality systems problems will be gone. You won't even have to think about quality ever after. And I got to imagine those are out there for HIPAA compliance. Tell us about that. Why does that not work to just say, I bought this software package, now I'm HIPAA compliant?
Yeah, it definitely, like I said, there's a lot to it. And part of HIPAA is always being diligent, always making sure that it's an ongoing thing. So you can't just do something, you can't just set up at once, buy some software that might start off to be HIPAA compliant, and then expect it to continue on over the life cycle of your company. And also, like I said, a lot of it is having these policies and procedures in place. So even if you buy a piece of software that was written with HIPAA in mind. In the end, if you don't have all the safeguards in place, if you don't have all the policies in place, you're not HIPAA compliant, and that's a huge aspect of it. So I think that there are a lot of sites that out there that might claim to help you with it, and like I said, there are tools out there that even we use, and it's going to make your life easier. But in the end, you need to have an overall view of HIPAA, and there can be maybe software out there that you can plug in for certain aspects and things that make your life easier. But in the end, HIPAA is going to be on you, and there's not going to be any software out there that's going to cover you 100%.
Yeah, it's great. And so many analogies there and synergies to the world of med device development. It's just such a similar set of principles. Well, as you guys have been engaged in this and done development for health tech companies, you got to have some stories. You got to have some experiences. What are the kinds of, I don't know if they're horror stories or good stories, but we often find those when people keep coming to us with the same problems over and over and over again. I got to keep telling them the same answer, the same solution over and over again. Any of those kind of anecdotes for us?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to hammer home on this BAA thing, but a lot of times startups will come to us and they won't realize, if you're going to sign a BAA with Slack, or if you're going to sign a BAA with Mailgun or Twilio, most of the time they're not going to give you that BAA because it's an extra burden on them unless you're on an enterprise plan, which is much more expensive. So something that might cost $10 a month for a normal startup might take you to 1,000 at the start, 1,000 a month just for texting. So a lot of times startups will come to us and say, oh, we're using Twilio, we've done this, and they just are not set up with the BAA, or they're not set up how they should be. And it's just a kind of, it's an easy enough thing to think about, but a lot of times people are just not executing and forgetting about that, because you might, at the start of your company life cycle, you might be very diligent about HIPAA this, HIPAA that, think about it. 2 years in, you might kind of forget about it, and all of a sudden you need texting or you need something else. You sign a new provider, and even address lookup, address search and address verification. If you do any type of mailing, and integrating with that, those providers are still going to need to have a BAA with them, and they need to be HIPAA compliant. So something that's really easily forgotten during the life cycle of a company, and we see that a lot.
That's great. So important. And you shouldn't feel bad for focusing on one thing, because oftentimes it is that one thing that just keeps getting missed, because oftentimes it takes effort to do, and we want to just buy a solution off the shelf, but that's often not the right solution. Well, we'll open it up for questions. If anyone has any other questions, thank you for the questions that came in while we were going through, but we'll certainly open it up for any other questions that may have arisen. But while we're waiting for those to come in, Adi, I'd love for you to tell us sort of more broadly about Near the Box, the kinds of things that you guys work on, maybe in some detail, and the kinds of companies that you're looking for. Who should be knocking on your door?
Yeah, I would love to. So we're getting more in the health tech space, working with more startups, and we're trying to come in as a partner more than a developer. So what we want to do is we want to come in with our experience. We've done this. Not only have we built products, and we kind of realize what goes into building a product over time. How do you take something that needs to be done, in a couple months, 3 to 6 months for your initial product launch, and how do you support that for years, for 3 to 5 years? And how do you scale from, the start 0 users to millions of users? And kind of what's the technical strategy that goes in place with that? Are you set up from a liability standpoint, and just how do you keep growing? So we're looking for more startups to work with that are looking for that type of partnership. So a lot of the times we're working with founders that might not be technical, or maybe they are technical, but they need help just scaling up and thinking bigger, and we have experience doing that. And so we kind of come in as that technical innovation partner and bring that engineering mindset to build stuff that lasts, build stuff the right way, and really scale.
Well, that's really cool. It's good to know you guys are in the ecosystem and growing and doing such cool stuff. And we're certainly glad for your expertise today. Not seeing any questions here. I'll ask, Adi, what are your closing thoughts for us today as people go about their med tech and health tech development?
Yeah, I would say that, there is no HIPAA checklist. Go back to the start start of what we talked
Yeah,
about. There's no
yeah.
checklist. You kind of need to be always diligent when thinking about HIPAA, and you need to. A lot of the HIPAA guidelines are from the perspective of physician office. Like when you're doing your security risk analysis, for instance, they might be asking, are you covering your computer screen so other people can't see it around you? And now most people are working from home, so it's not a real concern, especially in software development space. But there's just a wide variety of things to consider. So I would say that just getting very comfortable with the HIPAA guidelines and how it's written, and I would say just kind of talk to people who've done it before, and definitely legal advice is very, very helpful in this space.
Well, that's great. We certainly appreciate your expertise. Yeah, the last thing you said there about people working from home, but that opens up a whole new can of worms about who can access data on machines that aren't behind locked doors in offices. So
Yeah.
the problems keep coming to be solved. So that's great. How can people get a hold of you?
Yeah. So you can always get a hold of me through email or through my website, nearthebox.com, nearthebox.com. My email is listed there, but it's Agandra, Agandra at nearthebox.com. So I'm always happy to answer any questions or help in any way I can and provide any insight.
Well, Adi, we appreciate having you on the show today. Thank you so much for being with us.
All right. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks again. Well, we'll leave time at the end here, as always, for any Q&A or any check-ins. If you know of community events that are happening, please do let us know. Just getting over today, of course, the MedHealth Mixer going on to great effect these last 2 days. So hopefully you were able to tune into that. We'll give just another 30 seconds here for any community announcements, things coming up that would be of interest to the MedTech community. And not seeing any more of those today, I just want to thank you for being here on MedTech Crossroads. We appreciate your participation, and we look forward to next week. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.